Architecture is not just beautiful, but it's important. Well, we're going to go on a kind of a whirlwind review of what we covered the first week, and that will hopefully, by going over it again quickly, will just sort of help set it in your mind. And for those that weren't able to be here for the first class, that will help you kind of bring you up to speed where everybody else is. And we talked about how Newport architecture in general is a wonderful microcosm of American architecture from the colonial period through the Victorian and Gilded Age right up to the present, and that it's always been a place where architects and architectural clients have sort of had the opportunity and the budget to experiment a little bit, which means they're sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit. They're also at the cutting edge. And because it was sort of so central to both the kind of life of the American aristocracy in that late 19th century, a lot of these buildings were published in works like American Architect, and the architects who were living in Chicago and Wisconsin and Alabama and all over the country were getting images of Newport architecture and incorporating it into their. So we talked about how in the early days, really Newport was centered quite densely around this colonial era harbor that was one of the best on the East Coast, how we were the 5th largest city in America in 1776, which I think shocks most people. You know, we kind of think of ourselves as a sleepy little resort community that's an hour and a half off 95, and yet at that time, this was a place where not only tradesmen of many different religions set up and were finding a place to prosper on this new continent, including, of course, Quakers, Jews, Baptists, other people who were being shunned in colonies like Massachusetts and elsewhere. They were finding Newport to be a great place to make their goods and prosper. But it was very much concentrated in and around the harbor, so the Point District and Historic Hill were really where all of this population existed, and it was 10,000 people in that small area. So you can imagine it was really very, very dense. So this is the Blaskowitz map of 1777, soon after Great Britain took possession of Newport and made it a rather inhospitable place for those that did not see Great Britain as the natural and perennial ruler of the American colonies. This is the Galt and Hoy map of 1878. It's a visualization of these neighborhoods as they existed at that time. We have a blow up here in the lower frame of the Catherine K neighborhood, and you see that there's a lot of density towards Bellevue, and then more estates and kind of farms down to the point where Eustis Avenue is still largely unpopulated at this point, but growing as people are forced to kind of move further and further from Broadway and from Bellevue, which are the natural commercial hubs. These are the Sanborn maps, which are a wonderful documentation of what buildings existed, and you can see here in 1884, there really wasn't that much in the Catherine K neighborhood for them to document. And it's only later in 1896, 1903, and then here in 1921, where you see the full development of this neighborhood. But at the leading edge, obviously, were this partnership of McKim, Mead and White, creating these 6 and these buildings range from the earliest of 1876 to the final of the 6 being 1901, just 25 years later. Here they are in a larger map, each color-coded with a different color. You can see they range in size from very small for the current Francis Skinner House lot to rather large for the Commodore Edgar House of 1886. I was told that the lot for the Francis Skinner House had been twice as large. As we walked out around the properties last week, we all saw how there was a basic connecting theme between all of them, which was the house was located at the northern end of the property, and then the lawn spread out to the southern end so that the natural sunlight could find its way into the house, and that southern direction also served as the connection between the inside of the house and the exterior of the house, which is where people, of course, like to spend time playing croquet or lounging about, having garden parties. And that was a kind of a unifying theme of all the houses we saw. So here we have our 3 heroes, as it were, at later ages. Charles Fallen McKim, William Mead, who was a contemporary of Charles Fallen McKim, and was really the kind of management partner. And as an architect, I can tell you, although he doesn't get a lot of design credit, he did manage to turn this architectural partnership into something that was very, very successful, and was able to design, by the end of the partnership, upwards of more than 1,000 buildings. And then here you have Sanford White, who is known for his creativity. The creativity in his mustache alone gives you some indication that he wasn't shy about making a splash in public. He was sort of a self-trained guy. He was a wonderful draftsman. He was sort of raw material in the hands of Charles Fallen McKim, who had much more of the formal education, having been educated at Harvard and then traveling to Europe and studying at the École des Beaux-Arts. Sanford White had been a draftsman in H.H. Richardson's office, which was down the hall from the McKim office. And so they poached him after seeing some of his great drawings for the Watt Sherman House, and basically unleashed him on the world, starting with the Newport Casino project of 1880, which was McKim's introduction, McKim, Mead and White's introduction as a new partnership to the world, to Newport, to high society, and also showed a level of creativity both in its programming, coming up with a new idea, this idea of a palace of leisure, a country club, a place where you could play lawn tennis and coaching and play cards and do all kinds of things as a co-ed club, which is quite remarkable in itself. And also where some of these Queen Anne style vestiges started to drop away, and the focus on shingle decoration really kind of elevated itself to the centrality of the architectural work, and it's why the Newport Casino is often identified as the first building to kind of cross over that magical line from Queen Anne Revival style into what Vincent Scully of Yale University coined as the shingle style. Here is, of course, the before of those two, the Queen Anne style of the Wormley House with its round turret, very typical of that time. A lot of polychromy, wooden brackets, heavy wooden brackets, and panels showing that sort of stylistic aspect of that design style that you will see throughout the Catherine K neighborhood, but with a little bit of design flair. This Russian onion dome gilded is obviously one instance of McKim stepping out of the comfort lane of what everybody else is doing and creating something that's a little bit noteworthy, bold, design forward, if you will. And here we have the house where we gathered, the Samuel Tilton house. You can see here, I don't know, oh good, I should have pointed with this. So this was that front facade that we saw, and saw how kind of compact and understated that house is from the western side, the sunny side facade, and then how kind of much larger and expansive it is once you come onto the lawn and you see this kind of great gable being the primary four-story massing of the house, hiding these 8 bedrooms. I mean, an 8-bedroom house is no small thing. And I don't think many people looking at this facade here would guess that that was an 8-bedroom house. And then again here you have that one kind of very large space off of that. So this is really not so much a sculptural expression of architecture, but much more an expression of surface treatment, as we noted with the wonderful colored glass pebble dash motifs that were imprinted into the raw concrete. As we go through the house, you see how energetic and clever it is with some Japanese motifs. This looks like a sliding screen, but of course is not. Whereas in its cousin house, the house being built at the same time, the Isaac Bell House of Bellevue Avenue, also 1881-82, those actually were sliding screens. So they had that Asian quality, and the images of the Far East were just arriving to Newport and being incorporated into McKim, Mead and White's architecture as part of their adventurous quality, their inventiveness, their desire to kind of differentiate themselves from the work of other people that were doing something in a more stodgy way. We talked about how here on the stair, you have this big wide stair, but just for the lower piece. So as you turn the step and go up, it's a standard, 3.5 foot wide stair. And you realize, of course, that this becomes almost like a stage, that you can imagine the lady and gentleman of the house coming down to meet their guests in this lower area as the last owner and his wife liked to do when they were holding parties at this location. The woodwork is, of course, extraordinary, detailed, patterned, but using, as we discussed, standard industrial things like spool, the threads of spool, to put onto screens and to create decorative motifs using things that they could find elsewhere. And also the way in which, and this is sort of an early modern expression, they're using different woods to create patterns in the cabinets and in the ceiling to express the natural qualities of the material. And this is something that Frank Lloyd Wright picks up on, and that the modernists pick up on. The idea of painting things becomes anathema. Everything needs to be itself, whatever that is. Steel should look like steel, wood should look like wood. And this is a way to take that natural material and let it become a decorative motif in itself. And also how they're very creative in their use of this central oval for the mirror, which would have been fairly typical, but then creating 4 smaller ovals, almost like splashes, or it becomes a decorative motif. You know, you're not really seeing yourself in these small pieces the way you would in a large one, but it reflects the light, it reflects the color, it carries that large shape and radiates it outward as part of the decoration of the hearth in that living room component. Here, very similar period, we stood in front of the Francis Skinner house, also known as Volino, and this is much more what we think of as sort of pure shingle style design. You know, there aren't any real large panels. All of those Queen Anne elements have kind of drifted away, except for perhaps the corner round turret, which is now expanded to be almost the entire building, and the more traditional kind of witch's hat topping. But on this thing you see wonderful patterns of shingle. We talked about the way in which, where they didn't have windows, they decided to make panels of a different shingle pattern just to carry the rhythm. So it's a very kind of painterly approach to taking the exterior of the building and painting it, as it were, with different patterns of shingle to create interesting artistic motifs around the outside. Here we have the Samuel Coleman house. Now we're starting new buildings that we did not talk about at the last lecture here at the Powell Center. And this is, again, it's 1882, 1883, so very much in that same period, except this is different. It doesn't have that one strong single gable of the Tilton house. It doesn't have the more intricate and exaggerated Queen Anne style massing of Volino. It has much more of the American colonial reference to that gambrel form, which is extremely efficient. You see it in the Hunter House. You see it in a lot of Georgian style buildings here in the US, and particularly Newport, because it was able to utilize that space under the roof in the most efficient way, allowing every square inch to be occupied, which of course gets to both the thriftiness and also, I won't say the poverty, because certainly the Hunter House and other gambrel style houses have an elegance and grandeur of their own, but they are much, much more compact. They're much more practical in that there just wasn't space or material to waste within those. And here you see from this side, here's the north side of the building, the projecting gables of different sizes, the dormers, and then this entry dormer, which has this kind of projecting diamond roof piece, which you see here projecting out, which is almost like bulging out. You see the traditional colonial form, and then that's sort of McKim, Mead and White towing the line, as it were, giving you a form that looks familiar, that's easily understandable within the context of both the neighborhood in which they're working and the architectural history that they're part of. But then you have sort of that inventive part of things sort of popping up and out and pushing out, and especially this sort of diamond-shaped projection of the entry vestibule, to me, is interesting and creative, and I hadn't seen another example like that. And to me, it's sort of like a jazz player playing the notes as they are on the page, but adding some extra notes in between to show their flair, to show their ability, their creativity, and the fact that they don't want to be completely constrained by the established form that they're using as their starting point. So anyway, this is the Samuel Coleman House, also known as While Away or Boxcroft, which is now a condominium. Here we have the Commodore William Edgar House. This was one of the founders of the New York Yacht Club, and they all established a kind of an outpost here in Newport very early, so that they would bring their yachts from New York to Newport. That connection between the two is very long-standing. People sometimes ask me, why is there a New York Yacht Club in Newport? That doesn't make sense. And I'm like, well, it's a 120-year-old tradition, so it's a little late to try and change that now. They operated out of a much smaller outfit, which is now the Moorings restaurant. And it's only relatively recently that they acquired Harbor Court from the Brown family, which is now a really stately, elegant, and fairly grand. It's hard to call it an outpost because it's probably larger than their clubhouse on 44th Street is. But it certainly shows that they've always sort of been a club with two poles, one in New York and one in Newport. And Commodore William Edgar was one of the original founders of the club, and I think he was the second Commodore of the New York Yacht Club. And this was the house that he built for himself. We talked about how even by 1886, so this is really, it's only 6 years after, or 5 years after the Newport Casino, the Isaac Bell House, the Coleman House, Bellino, all of these wonderful shingle-style masterpieces that Vincent Scully would say really represent one of the high points of American architecture because of their creativity. And now here we are, we're in the 20th century. 1901, you had the construction of the Elms by Trumbauer. You had the design and completion of the construction of Rosecliff by McKim, Mead and White. which was an even grander, but very symmetrical, very European-inspired building. And the shingle style of the Isaac Bell House must have seemed a world away from these grand European, symmetrical, classical expressions of architecture. And not that these aren't great architecture too, they're just more derivative, they're more referential at the both the elms and the Rosecliff. There were specific European models that they were referencing that any architect or well-educated client could say, oh yes, that reminds me of the Petit Trianon, or the palace outside of Versailles for Marie Antoinette. And on the inside, again, you have that heavy decoration. The balusters are turned. The ceilings, like we see here, are plaster in intricate patterns, filling the space, not in an inventive way. That wasn't the goal. It was more about connoisseurship, being able to reference those European standards, meeting the European standards. There really was a sense at this time, as America kind of came to the world stage following World War, following the Civil War, that we were, from an industrial standpoint, starting to compete with pretty much every other school of design in the world, but yet we still were a young country. We didn't have that sense of confidence. And so where now McKim is no longer designing little houses for widows in Newport, Rhode Island, they're asked to do a master plan for the relocation of Columbia University from its original King's College location downtown. And Columbia still owns a lot of the real estate of Manhattan because of what they were given by the king, and that's the basis of their endowment. They graciously moved way up to above 110th Street, which at one point must have seemed like, Vermont, as far as the rest of Manhattan thought. And they were almost like a academic enclave. And again, they used sort of a European model for their master plan. So you have these great steps, sort of like the Spanish steps in Rome. You have this central building, the low library, in the center of campus. And this, of course, represents the Pantheon in Rome. And then you have these buildings that are symmetrical not only in themselves and not only matched by symmetrical buildings along the axis. This is a chapel, and this is the School of Architecture where I studied right there. And you have symmetry in multiple ways. This becomes almost like the Acropolis, where you move up onto this higher plane, and you, as the scholar and student, are at this elevated level, looking down on the city from one or two stories. Now, of course, that allowed them to put all of the mechanical and other functional spaces down below ground, so you kind of work your way down 1 or 2 or 3 levels to get to the bowels of some of these buildings, because they created their own false Acropolis, as it were, here. But So they're designing first the campus. This is 1893 and 94. And then they had to design each one of those individual buildings, one after the other. So you could see that they were rather engaged. Little buildings in Newport, Rhode Island were no longer their bread and butter, but doled out as special favors to people that they couldn't say no to for whatever reason. Also, whoops, sorry. The other thing that they were designing or being part of was the 1893 exposition, Columbia Exposition in Chicago. And they were invited to design the New York building, which was like this, a similar designed campus where all of the buildings were scaled and to the similar height so that they would be read as a composition, and then one large central building in the middle that sort of served as a temple. And what's important about that 1893 exposition is that it is America's coming out party. It's America saying to the world, we are ready to reveal ourselves and to invite you to come to our new continent, a continent discovered by Columbus. Since then, we've discovered there were actually some people here before then, which we give a lot more credit to, but at that time, it was really the Western seed of knowledge and industry that was being allowed to flourish on the North American continent. And there in Chicago, at the center of this vast virgin forest and land that we as Americans were so blessed with, was this 1893 Columbia Exposition, which had, I can't remember the numbers, but it was enormous. Many people from across the United States made the pilgrimage there, as did people from Europe. And the idea that Europeans would come to the United States to see architecture and be interested in what we had from a cultural standpoint was extraordinary. It truly was the apprentice becoming the master. And certainly in the case of Charles Follen McKim and Richard Morris Hunt, who were very central to the design and the kind of marshaling of American architects in that 1893 project. You had people who had studied in Europe, taken on that apprenticeship, come back to the United States, had 20 or 30 years, as in the case of Hunt, returning in 1864. Here he is now 30 years later at the end of his career, showing both his fellow Americans and the architects of the world that the United States was ready to be compared and stand on their own and go toe-to-toe, as it were, with the European models. And you certainly see that in buildings like Marble House, where the Vanderbilts put the image of Massart, Louis XIV's architect, and then facing him in a medallion the exact same size, the bust of Richard Morris Hunt. So they're on the same level, nose to nose, on equal footing. And of course, the entire building is filled with images of the Sun King, Louis XIV, who had lived 150 years earlier, who had been the preeminent power in Europe had ruled basically all of Europe except for perhaps England, and certainly had influenced England in terms of design style and artistic authority, as it were. The Vanderbilts in that building are saying, yep, we're now the Sun Kings of this new continent. We are their equal. We are in wealth and power and artistic connoisseurship, what those European people were. And so that moment is both kind of a high point in American architecture, but also, as the Gilded Age, as we remember the Gilded Age, also, what is it they say, pride goeth before the fall? They were living in a world that had 3% income tax on the first $1 million that you made, which, I mean, I know we'd all like to make $1 million today, but in 1890, $1 million really was a lot of money. And so they didn't see what was ahead. They didn't see the change industrialization was going to have and pulling staff out of their houses. They weren't going to see what World War I was going to do, and in the industrialization of both war but also production, which was going to take all those people that were washing their clothes and cooking their food and trimming their lawns and all the different functions that they needed done in order to live in these enormous houses and remove them for other purposes. And they certainly didn't see what was coming in 1929 with the Great Depression, where a lot of this overextension from an investment standpoint came home to roost. Now, some were very clever and figured out how to avoid that, and so here in Newport, the Gilded Age lasted a lot longer than it lasted other places, because some people sort of pulled their wealth in before the crash and were able to subsist on it for quite a while. But like a car that's running but unable to put more gas in the tank, it could only go so far. And so in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of these great houses by that point were being turned into condominiums or schools, or in some cases being torn down just because they were a tax burden that the owners could not pay. And they chose to demolish them and replace them with small house lots because that was a way for them to realize the economic value of them and to cover the tax of them. So anyway, in the story of McKim, Mead and White, we really do have this flowering in the shingle style of this unique American style architecture, inventive, creative, original, that begins to affect other architects throughout the country, like Frank Lloyd Wright in his prairie style architecture. Vincent Scully has shown pretty conclusively that published plans of the Isaac Bell House found their way into Frank Lloyd Wright's work soon thereafter. And then, of course, that is a reflowering of that American spirit. But here in Newport, we sort of left that rather quickly, moving back into neoclassicism, into Neo-Palladianism, into works like the Commodore Edgar House, the George Gordon King House, Rosecliff, and then that era would pass with the challenges of World War I, the Great Depression and then World War II kind of set the last nail in the Gilded Age coffin. I would say really it was on life support after World War I, and then any kind of lingering parts of it disappeared. Even the great Penn Station, which if you've seen pictures of it, was another McKim, Mead and White thing made out of steel. It was like a cathedral of glass and steel, and as Vincent Scully said, we used to enter New York like gods, and after they destroyed the original Penn Station and rebuilt it, and now we slither in like rats. So with that, we'll talk about the era of gods, which is certainly McKim, Mead and White, and I thank you for listening, and I would welcome any questions you have. Yes, Susan?
Ross, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts at all about the death of Stanford White and what influence it may or may not have had on the direction that that firm went in terms of their designs.
Well, the death of Stanford White, as many of you know, was called the crime of the century before the next 5 or 6 crimes of the century. But it really was something extraordinary, where a guy named Harry K. Thaw, who was married to a woman with whom Stanford White had been previously known, as they say, in delicate terms, came to the roof of Madison Square Garden, which was the preeminent club in Manhattan at that time, pulled out a gun and shot him, ending his life and his career. It's the central story that's part of ragtime. So we're talking about the 1920s, that kind of roaring period. It certainly took away that creative powerhouse within the firm, but at that point he was already in his late 50s, early 60s. He could have certainly designed many more buildings beyond, but I would say in a way it was an exclamation point at the end of what was the Gilded Age. He was the Gilded Age architect par excellence. Harry K. Thaw was a client, part of that kind of landed gentry. Harry K. Thaw spent a year in a penitentiary, a hospital, and then inherited a house at the end of Bellevue Avenue. So his life wasn't too terrible, but Stanford White was beloved. He wasn't a member of that set. For those of you that are watching Gilded Age, Stanford White is a character there, and he says, well, I'm not nearly so fashionable as you would like me to be in order to introduce you to high society. So he was a servant to that group, but was never a member of that group. So in a way, who knows? I'm sure he would have created more work, great works, but so much had already been completed in that time, and they were already, the Great Depression was just around the corner, and that would be basically a 10-year gap when there would be very little work done. And at the end of that time, he would have been, probably passed by natural causes. He was a pretty flamboyant guy by all accounts. Drank a lot, danced a lot, kept company with women that weren't his wife a lot, and but perhaps that flamboyance and that ability to break convention was also part and parcel of his inventiveness and his ability to create architecture, unlike anything that had been seen before.